So this week we are getting into the actual textbook. You did a little bit with the tutorials that you did in week 1, but week 2 we're actually diving into our first chapter for this course, which is chapter 24, the opening of the Cold War from 1945 to 1961. The Cold War goes into the 80s, you could even argue like into the 90s, but we're just doing a small chunk of it for this chapter. So the book gets into discussing almost immediately these mutual misunderstandings between the Soviet Union and the United States. I think it's also really important to note, and I'm not sure if it discusses it in this chapter or not, but President Truman, who becomes president when Roosevelt dies in office, he is going to obviously be the one that drops the 2 atomic bombs on Japan, right? So Truman gets read in very quickly on the Manhattan Project, makes the decision along with his administration, along with the military, to drop these 2 bombs. But the difference between Truman's relationship with the Soviet Union, who we were allies with in World War II, and the relationship with the Soviet Union when we had Franklin Roosevelt as the president are very different. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Stalin got along for the most part, right? They had treaties that they had worked on throughout World War II. But when Truman comes into office, he does not like Stalin. And he even publicly announces that, and newspapers carry that message. So there was this mutual hatred, but hate is such a strong word, but I don't think they really hate each other. They just didn't like each other. So that's part of the misunderstanding, these 2 personalities leading their countries and how they don't get along with one another. So you'll read more about more misunderstandings between the 2. And also, Cold War means that we don't actually have any like military fighting going on, right? So a hot war would be like World War II. Then we get into this Cold War where we're like on the brink of war with each other and we're doing things to hurt each other. Like we're stirring things up in Western Europe, we're stirring things up in the Middle East on purpose to try to get the other one to react. So it's kind of this cat and mouse or chess game between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. There are a couple of hot wars that do break out where we do have boots on the ground, military fighting, and that would be like the Vietnam War and the Korean conflict. The Korean conflict, it's funny because the United States never actually declared war with Korea. And so it's not technically the Korean War, although you'll hear veterans refer to it that way. You'll hear some historians refer to it as the Korean War, but it's really the Korean conflict because the United Nations were the ones who declared war on Korea. Just happened to use a lot of U.S. military force in that conflict that the United Nations had with Korea. But you'll read more about that in the text. During this time, we also come up with this economic aid package. I think you'll get the exact numbers. It's $13 billion were approved by U.S. Congress to send to war-torn countries in Europe to help rebuild their economies. And it's known as the Marshall Plan because George C. Marshall is the one that came up with it. And the Soviet Union was invited to be part of this, but they decided that they didn't want to, and you're going to read about all the different reasons why they don't want to. There's this one part where George Marshall talks about free elections in one of the sources that you're going to be looking at. And what he's implying by free elections is more of like a democratic state, democracy, where everyone's voice is heard. And as you will find out, the Soviet Union doesn't hold up their end of the deal at the end of World War II, and they mess with free elections like in Poland, and they don't allow for these democratic elections to happen. That's also the answer to the question. One of those questions, you'll see what I mean when you get to that source that you're going to be looking at. So in response to that, the Soviet Union is like, we don't want to be part of that. We don't want you telling us how we can and can't spend our money. We want to be economically independent. So their reaction to that is known as the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, originally called the Molotov Plan. They're going to change that name. One thing that we didn't realize with the Soviet Union at the end of the war is that they had actually lost a lot more people than we thought. A lot of people died in Russia and throughout the Soviet Union, and we didn't realize how weak they actually were because they put up this good front that they were still going strong, but they lost millions of people during World War II. If we had known that, we probably could have used more force into getting what we wanted from the Soviet Union, but we didn't know those numbers until way after World War II, how really bad things were in the Soviet Union. We also, at this time, came up with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization called NATO, and this map here gives you like the NATO countries, and then in response to that, the Soviet Union comes up with their own, known as the Warsaw Pact. So members of Warsaw are here in the red. This purple line is the imaginary Iron Curtain that came down across Europe, and this was a quote by Winston Churchill. He said about the Iron Curtain has fallen. So that's what's happening kind of overseas. Back home, we've got a lot of Red Scare happening, like another, oh no, is this like the second wave of communism coming through? And this guy here, his name is Senator McCarthy. He is going to be the one that really stirs up this hysteria that's going on. And it's an era in history known as McCarthyism. And you're going to read about McCarthyism, but what he does is he creates what's known as the big lie. Something so crazy that it must be true. Like, for instance, I am so weird, I have to be from another planet, like the planet Venus. And people are like, oh my gosh, she really is weird. She's so like crazy sometimes. She really must be from another planet. And people just start to buy into this lie, and that's what was happening with McCarthyism. He was like, I have like 200 people that are working in the government, and they're really working for the communist nations, and people are like, oh my gosh, that could really be happening though, like we never know. And it was all fake. He made it all up. He couldn't prove that anyone was actually working for the Soviet Union. So he ruins a lot of careers. We have the Hollywood 10 that are blacklisted from Hollywood, screenwriters, directors, actors, a whole group of people that are out of work because of this hysteria that's believed. And you can read more about that in the chapter as well. Then we also start to dabble in other things in other nations, and we start to really worry about how close communism is hitting home at home. And you have to keep in mind, we have atomic bombs, and we're continuing to develop and make those, right? Nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union is doing the same thing. And in the 1950s, they're going to successfully launch their own warheads. And so now it's like, okay, there's a lot of hysteria and a lot of people are scared. Like, what are we going to do if they end up dropping an atomic bomb on the United States? We saw what it did to Japan. So when the Soviet Union and Cuba start having these agreements and these talks, people get really scared because Cuba is only like a couple miles off the US coast. It's really close. If they are able to set up missiles there, they can directly aim them at our nation's capital and take our capital out, along with other strategic cities around the United States if they're that close. So that's why we get involved with trying to keep communism like in check and try to contain it. And you'll learn more about this doctrine of containment. But that's why people are scared of communism and infiltration into the government, if that's really happening or not, and what are we going to do? And so we start to really get our hands involved in different countries around the world, all under the guise of, oh, we're just trying to stop communism from influencing this part of the world. But you have to keep in mind, we wanted influence in that part of the world as well. So here's some more videos to go over the Cold War. They're both crash course videos, but I encourage you to watch them because it really gets into the details of what's in your book and kind of explains it better for some of you who maybe are a visual learner. And after reading this chapter, you should be able to do these 4 things: analyze the causes of the Cold War, explain how the overall strategy of containment changed between 1948 and 1953, how, in particular, how the Korean War affected U.S. cold strategy and presidential power, analyze the effects of the Cold War on domestic policy, and then finally to evaluate how the Eisenhower administration managed containment throughout the world. Here are your assignments for this module. So the learning curve, of course. This is the source that the 2 sources that you're going to read over, and then these are the questions over those sources. And then you've got 2 maps for Map Quiz Chapter 24. So the first one is this one. You'll notice this one, I think this is Map 24.1. And then also one about the Korean War, Korean conflict. They're both all on this one quiz. Then here's the other source that you're going to be reading over. Actually, it's two sources that you're going to be reading over. And then here are the questions for those sources that you'll need to answer. Feel free to use the PowerPoint if you would like to. And as always, if for some reason these are not working, you can just look directly in the module and these will all be under the Start Here page.